BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Alright, well, welcome to our discussion on the Great Zodiac Killer Hoax of 1986 by Thomas Henry Horan. And if this is the first one that you've clicked on, you'll see that this is listed as part 11, but if you haven't heard the previous segments, you can keep listening because we're just having a discussion about the Zodiac Killer and a very prominent alternative theory out there. And today is the time when we get to the Paul Stine murder, October 11th of 1969. And in reality, this is the final confirmed Zodiac murder. And it's still, no matter how many times we've said it, it never ceases to amaze me that the heart and soul of Zodiac activity goes from December of 1968 only to October of 69, less than one calendar month of Zodiac activity that is confirmed. Of course, some people say Sherry Joe Bates and the possibility of 37 murders that the Zodiac committed, but the confirmed killings are only from December of 68 to October of 69. We've done a couple uploads about the Paul Stine murder on this channel, so I think this is one that we can really kind of just dive right into. But I would like to begin with something from the conspiracy theory skeptic Mark Roberts. And what he said was, when you're talking to somebody about new theories, if they want to say, I want to dispute this fact, someone has stated something that they believe as a fact, and you want to dispute that, and they want to say something to the contrary, that's good. Those are the types of discussions that you can have. But when someone just puts out a far-out, wacky theory, it is so much more difficult and practically nearly impossible to truly challenge them on that. Because, it's just taking somebody's word for it, it's based on speculation, and it's going in a lot of very different directions. I just wanted to throw that out, and let's just be aware of that when we're looking at a lot of alternative Zodiac theories. But yes, indeed, Paul Stine was a taxi driver. He was the final Zodiac victim, the first time that we did not have the Zodiac targeting a couple, and he died from a single gunshot wound in his taxi cab. He was then robbed. And let's look at some of the things that Thomas Henry Horan has to say about Paul Stine. A very big point here that is mentioned is, even no matter what source you're going to be looking at with the Zodiac Killer, they talk about how the Zodiac, or the person who murdered Paul Stine, walked past the police officers, but an all-points bulletin had been issued saying that the suspect was a black man. The police were thinking that they needed to be looking for a black man, and there was actually a moment when the police could have apprehended the Zodiac if only they hadn't been looking for a black man. And there's some conflicting reports. There's one account that's described by Graysmith that even this person who would allegedly have been the Zodiac Killer even stopped to talk to the police. And like, hey, did you see anything? Yeah, there was some guy with a gun down there. Okay, what Thomas Horan says is a lot of that just plain did not happen. And, I mean, he really wants to be accurate with a lot of the details. But when you look at some of these things here, I mean, just to read a little bit, there is absolutely no record of this blunder reported anywhere in the files of the San Francisco Police Department or in any newspaper, referring to that specific instance that a dispatcher put out in APB on a black male after the Paul Stine murder. The claim was in a memo on November 12th. However, just because he thought or assumed that the suspect was black does not automatically mean that he was described that way by the dispatcher. That's the next line. Alright, so this will be one of the few times when you'll hear me quote Larry King on this channel. When he would be faced with something like that, he would just be like, so what's the big deal? They're practically the same. No, I mean, Horan's trying to be accurate, but he just says, it wasn't the dispatcher that issued this APB saying, look out for a black male after the Paul Stine murder. It's that the officers in the area expected to find a black person. They assumed that the perpetrator was black by their own wrongdoing. So they thought that they were going to be looking for a black male, when in reality, of course, it was somebody else. And in this chapter on the Paul Stine murder, I didn't hear anything about the Jordanian immigrant who is the alternative suspect in the Paul Stine murder. You see, the big thing with Thomas Henry Horn is he really wants us to know that there are alternative suspects out there. At Lake Herman Road, we said there was an individual named Big Red that was given up by 2 jailhouse informants. At Lake Berryessa, the alternative suspect was an individual named Dennis Land. And during the Paul Stine murder, the alternative suspect is a Jordanian immigrant that was involved with a series of taxi cab robberies over the course of 1969. Somebody who had lots of gambling debts. They do say that there was a serial cab robber, for lack of a better term, someone who had committed these robberies, but he didn't provide anything about the perpetrator's identity or even his background. Just says that there was a string of cab robberies in San Francisco in 1969 in this book here. I mean, I was drawing upon a different source where Thomas Henry Horn described the Jordanian immigrant who was involved in a series of cab robberies. Now, to look at something else here, we also introduce another person into the mix, and his name is Keith Power, a reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle. There's a very famous thing about how Paul Stine was murdered on Washington and Cherry Street. But he actually wanted to drive the person in the backseat of the car who committed the murder to Washington and Maple. Thomas Henry Horn says that there is no record of that anywhere other than coming from this guy Keith Power. The trip log was taken before the police examined it. I mean, the police had no way to examine the trip log. It wasn't published anywhere. It's just very simply that the only source that we have is from this Chronicle reporter named Keith Power. But here comes another thing. I mean, let's just have a read. I think that'll be the best way to do it. The San Francisco Police Department believed at the time that Paul Stine picked up his last fare in front of the Fairmont Hotel on Nob Hill, 4 blocks north of the Pinecrest. To this day, the San Francisco Police Department does not have Paul Stine's fare book in their possession. Either Keith Power made up the story about the trip sheet in order to corroborate an erroneous claim in a Zodiac letter, and in parentheses it says, "Why?" ? Or he went out of the parking garage adjacent to the Hall of Justice and removed it from the cab himself. Now here's the thing, though, that I take exception with Thomas Henry Horn. How come this guy, Thomas Horn, can't just accept that sometimes people make mistakes in their reporting, sometimes people put out, they might make an assumption that wasn't true, or that they might just make errors. Maybe they believe something to be true and they printed it anyway because they thought it was a connecting piece. I mean, why does he say, though, that this guy, Keith Power, contributed to corroborate an erroneous claim in a Zodiac letter? Think about all the people that we've talked about who are also in on this thing. I mean, and now we have to add in Keith Power, a reporter for the Chronicle. So he's in on this Zodiac hoax thing as well. I mean, like I said, we're starting to get a lot of people. And it's not to say that 7 people can't have some type of secret agenda. It's not to say that 17 or 27 people cannot have some secret or some type of agenda. All we're saying with that one is it's starting to get a little bit more complicated, and there are a lot of assumptions are being made if we're going to be going down that way. But what he says is the other possibility. Keith Power went out to the parking garage adjacent to the Hall of Justice and removed it from the cab himself. So, I mean, that's one of the reasons why he believed Keith Power was able to have that trip log and that he knew where Paul Stine was going, and that's the only source of this. We do need to remark, though, that Thomas Henry Horn has read the entire Zodiac case file, all 2,500 pages, but at the same time, though, it's like we're starting to pull in a lot of people involved into this Zodiac hoax theory, and it's getting messier and messier. And I'm really not sure how much we can accept that. Another thing that we should say is, in one of the letters that was mailed after the Paul Stine incident, the Zodiac killer talked about protecting his fingerprints. He was like, the police think they have some of my fingerprints after the Paul Stine murder. Well, they don't, because the Zodiac put airplane cement on his fingertips so that he wouldn't get caught, or that he wouldn't leave any fingerprints behind, and he even taunted the police in a letter with that. what I could say about that is, does anybody else just think that that's absolute bullshit? I mean, for lack of a better term. I mean, being a little harsh with the language, but does anyone just think that that's a total fabrication on behalf of the Zodiac killer or whichever perpetrator left the fingerprints behind? Someone's like, oh crap, I left some fingerprints behind during that Paul Stine murder. And I think all parties are in agreement. The person who committed the Paul Stine murder just got lucky. They were just very fortunate to get out of there without leaving anything behind. But it almost seems like the Zodiac is really stretching the truth with that one. The person who wrote the letter, anyway. Once again, we're somewhat open to the possibility that this is all a hoax and that this is all being orchestrated by how many people have we talked about so far? But the thing is, though, some other things that Horan provides in this chapter here is that the fingerprints in question were not on the driver's side door. They were actually on the passenger side. Sorry, not the passenger side. It's the passenger door on the driver's side of the car. You know how you have a sedan with 4 doors? It would be the passenger door that is behind the driver's seat, because the killer would have had to have grabbed Paul Stine sitting right behind him and pulled the trigger, and that's where they believe the fingerprints are. But one of the big things, though, that Horan might actually have a point with is there was a scene about how the perpetrator would have taken Paul Stine's head, cradled him in his lap while he was robbing him. That most likely did not happen, because the police brought canine units. Blood dogs came to the scene. We talked about blood dogs a lot with the Madeleine McCann case, and they would have been able to trace the scent much more effectively if the perpetrator had been dripping in blood. Not to mention that the police are going to see somebody dripping in blood and not notice if they say that this guy had blood all over him and the police even saw him and the police stopped to talk to him. So, as you see, maybe that part of the narrative is a little bit, well, incorrect according to Robert Graysmith. I definitely think that Graysmith is wrong, but once again, we got to say deliberate fabrications over accidental errors in his research, and not to mention perhaps just trying to write a better story because he wanted to sell a book or something like that. But that's still quite to the contrary of what Thomas Horan is saying, that Graysmith cooked up this whole thing as a fiction for various reasons. And we're about halfway through the book, actually. That was just chapter 5, but we are more than halfway through this book, although these things are probably going to come out a little... I would like to do a lot more in one segment, to be honest, to have like maybe multiple chapters will come out in the next segment. So the big takeaways from this one is we're introducing more characters. The thing about the Washington and Maple Street only comes from Keith Power, which isn't even in the San Francisco Police Department file. There were fingerprints found at the scene. The Zodiac denied that those fingerprints were his. I don't believe that for a second. I think if this was indeed the Zodiac, then he would have genuinely messed up and perhaps left a fingerprint behind. We're talking one single fingerprint, so I believe. And then we would also have, another thing we haven't mentioned is the fragment of Paul Stine's shirt was removed at the scene, but I don't necessarily think that, we've covered that in a previous upload, so we don't need to go over that one again. And the other thing is that this possibly was done by a Jordanian immigrant who had a series of gambling debts, and he robbed several taxi drivers. He's the alternative suspect. Which do you think is more likely? Challenge question for the day. Zodiac killer or some guy robbing taxi cabs to pay off a gambling debt? Not to mention, though, that we don't have much information on him. And the other thing is, though, how many people are going to be in on this hoax theory? When does it end? How far out is this going to go? But anyway, that's kind of what we have to say about the Paul Stine murder. What do you have to say? What do you think about the things that Paul Stine has put forward? He wants to get the narrative 100% correct, but at the same time, not super, it's like some of these things aren't the most valuable, I believe. They aren't really valuable to cracking the case. It's like, as we said, somewhat similar information. Well, that's all from me now. I would love to hear from you, and until next time.